In the mountain village of Cathara, where the morning mist clung to ancient stone houses like forgotten dreams, lived a young woman whose beauty had become her curse. Amara possessed the kind of radiance that made flowers seem pale and the moon jealous. Her hair flowed like liquid midnight, her eyes sparkled like captured starlight, and her smile could melt the hardest heart. But in Cathara, such beauty was not a blessing. The village followed old traditions, older than memory itself. The elders spoke in hushed whispers about women whose beauty brought misfortune, who attracted evil spirits and brought drought to the crops. They believed that extraordinary beauty upset the balance of nature, that it was a sign of dark magic brewing within a person's soul. These beliefs had been passed down through generations like a poisonous inheritance. Amara's troubles began when she turned 18. Before that, she'd been just another child running through the cobblestone streets, playing with wooden dolls and helping her mother tend their small herb garden. But as she blossomed into womanhood, people started to notice. Men would stop their work to stare, causing accidents at the blacksmith's forge and delays in the harvest. Women would whisper jealously behind their hands, pointing at her as she walked past. Her mother, Alara, had tried to protect her daughter by keeping her hidden. She would send Amara to gather herbs only in the early morning when few people were awake, or late in the evening when shadows provided cover. Alara would braid Amara's hair tightly and wrap it in plain cloth, hoping to dim her daughter's natural glow. She even rubbed mud on Amara's face sometimes, telling people her daughter was sick when they came looking. But beauty like Amara's could not be hidden forever. It was like trying to cover the sun with a thin piece of cloth. The light would always find a way to shine through. The first real trouble came during the harvest festival. The village celebrated this time every year with dancing, singing, and a great feast in the central square. Young people would dress in their finest clothes, and families would showcase their daughters to potential suitors. Alara had begged Amara to stay home, but the girl was lonely. She had spent so many months hidden away that she desperately wanted to feel normal, to laugh with other young people and enjoy the music. Against her mother's wishes, Amara snuck out wearing a simple brown dress and a thick shawl pulled over her head. She thought she could blend into the crowd, watch the festivities from the shadows, and return home without anyone noticing. How wrong she was. The moment she stepped into the square, it was as if time stopped. Musicians forgot their melodies, dancers stumbled mid-step, and conversations died on people's lips. Even with her plain clothes and covered hair, Amara's beauty shone like a beacon in the night. Her graceful walk, the way the torchlight caught her eyes, the gentle curve of her smile as she watched the performers, everything about her was mesmerizing. Within minutes, a crowd had gathered around her. Young men pushed each other aside to get closer, offering her food, drinks, and flowers. They competed for her attention, their voices growing louder and more desperate. Some even started pushing and shoving, their friendly rivalry turning into something darker. The women in the crowd grew angry. They had spent hours preparing for this festival, braiding their hair with flowers, wearing their most beautiful dresses, hoping to catch the eye of a good man. Now their carefully planned evening was ruined by this girl, who had appeared like a ghost and stolen all the attention without even trying. Old Maeva, the village's head elder and most respected wise woman, pushed through the crowd with her walking stick raised. Her weathered face was twisted with fury as she pointed a gnarled finger at Amara. Her voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Witch!" she screamed, and the word echoed through the square like thunder. "Look how she bewitches our men! Look how she brings chaos to our peaceful celebration. This is the work of dark magic." The crowd fell silent, the festive mood completely shattered. People stepped back from Amara, as if she carried a plague. The young men who had been fighting for her attention now looked at her with suspicion and fear. The musicians put down their instruments, and mothers pulled their children close to their sides. Amara stood alone in the center of the square, her heart pounding like a trapped bird against her ribs. She had never used magic, had never even believed in it. She was just a girl who wanted to enjoy a festival like everyone else, but the fear in people's eyes told her that explanations would be useless. "I'm not a witch," she said, her voice small and frightened. "I've done nothing wrong. I just wanted to watch the dancing." Old Maeva laughed, a sound like crackling autumn leaves. "Nothing wrong? Child, your very existence is wrong. Beauty like yours doesn't come from nature. It comes from making deals with dark spirits. You've sold your soul for this cursed appearance, and now you bring that curse upon our village." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. People began sharing stories of recent misfortunes, A cow that had died mysteriously, crops that had failed despite good weather, a child who had fallen ill with fever. In their fear and superstition, they found ways to blame everything on Amara's presence. Her mother appeared at the edge of the square, having realized that her daughter was missing. Alara's face went pale when she saw Amara surrounded by the angry crowd. She tried to push forward to reach her daughter, but strong hands held her back. "Please!" Alara cried out. "She's just a girl. She means no harm to anyone." But her pleas fell on deaf ears. The crowd's fear had turned to anger, and their anger was turning to something much more dangerous. Old Maeva raised her walking stick again, her voice growing stronger and more commanding. "This cursed child cannot remain among us," she declared. "Tomorrow, when the sun rises, she will face the trial of truth. If she is innocent, the spirits will protect her. If she is guilty of witchcraft, they will deliver their judgment." Amara knew about the trial of truth from whispered stories and old legends. It was an ancient ritual that the village had not used for over 50 years. The accused would be taken to the sacred grove, a circle of twisted trees on the mountainside where the spirits were said to dwell. There, they would face tests that would reveal their true nature. Many who faced the trial never returned. The crowd began to disperse, but not before the village guards came to take Amara away. They bound her hands with rough rope and led her to the stone chamber beneath the elders' hall, a cold, dark room that served as the village jail. As they locked the heavy wooden door behind her, Amara could hear her mother's sobs echoing through the night. Alone in the darkness, Amara pressed her back against the damp stone wall and tried not to cry. Through the small barred window high above her head, she could see the stars twinkling like distant jewels. She wondered if those same stars looked down on other villages where beautiful women were celebrated instead of feared, where being different wasn't a crime punishable by death. She thought about her childhood, about running through meadows filled with wildflowers, about learning to read from her grandmother's old books, about helping her mother heal sick animals with herbal remedies. None of those memories seemed to contain any magic, except the simple magic of being alive and happy. How had something as natural as growing up and becoming beautiful turned her into a monster in people's eyes? As the hours passed, Amara could hear people gathering outside, their voices carrying through the stone walls. They were planning for tomorrow's trial, discussing the rituals that had to be performed, the preparations that needed to be made. Some voices called for mercy, suggesting that exile would be punishment enough. But others, led by old Maeva's harsh tones, demanded that the trial be carried out fully, whatever the consequences. Near dawn, Amara finally fell into a restless sleep, her dreams filled with twisted trees and accusing faces. She didn't know that several villages away, a young warrior was breaking camp and preparing to continue his journey toward Kithara. She didn't know that his arrival would change everything, or that her trial would become the beginning of a story that would be told for generations. She only knew that when the sun rose, she would face a test that could end her life, accused of a crime she had never committed, punished for a gift she had never asked for. In her dreams, she ran through endless forests, searching for a place where beauty was not a curse, where being different was not a death sentence. But even in her dreams, the twisted trees of the sacred grove loomed ahead, waiting to pass judgment on a girl whose only crime was being too beautiful for a world full of fear and superstition. The morning mist hung heavy over Kithara as the villagers gathered in the central square before sunrise. Word had spread quickly through neighboring settlements about the trial, and people had traveled from distant farms and mountain villages to witness the ancient ritual. The air buzzed with nervous energy and whispered conversations as everyone waited for the ceremony to begin. Amara was dragged from her cell while the stars still glittered in the pre-dawn sky. Her hands remained bound, and the village guards flanked her on both sides as they led her through the streets she had walked freely just yesterday. People lined the path, some throwing stones and rotten vegetables, others simply staring with a mixture of fear and fascination. A few women spat as she passed, calling her names under their breath. Old Maeva waited at the head of the procession, dressed in ceremonial robes decorated with symbols that were older than the village itself. She carried a staff topped with carved bones and feathers, and her eyes gleamed with religious fervor. Behind her stood the other elders, their faces grave and determined. They had convinced themselves that they were saving the village from a great evil, that their harsh actions were necessary to protect innocent people. The procession began its slow climb up the mountain path toward the sacred grove. The trail was steep and rocky, winding through pine forests and across streams swollen with spring snowmelt. Amara's feet, shod only in thin slippers, began to bleed as sharp stones cut through the worn soles. But she didn't cry out or ask for mercy. She had decided during the long night in her cell that she would face whatever came with dignity, even if it meant her death. As they climbed higher, the trees grew more twisted and strange. Ancient pines bent into impossible shapes, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. Strange mushrooms grew in circles around dark stones, and the air itself seemed to hum with an energy that made the hair on people's arms stand up. Birds fell silent in this part of the mountain, and even the insects seemed to avoid the area. The sacred grove sat in a natural clearing near the mountain's peak, surrounded by 13 enormous trees that had grown in a perfect circle. Local legends claimed these trees were as old as the world itself, that they had witnessed the birth of the first humans and would see the end of all things. Their bark was black as midnight, and their roots twisted together underground like a massive web. In the center of the circle stood a flat stone altar, stained dark with the blood of countless sacrifices over the centuries. The villagers arranged themselves around the outer edge of the grove, afraid to step too close to the ancient trees. Old Maeva led Amara to the center and bound her to the stone altar with chains that had been blessed by generations of village priests. The metal felt ice cold against Amara's skin, and she could smell the rust and old blood that stained the ancient links. "Spirits of the sacred grove," old Maeva called out, her voice echoing strangely among the twisted branches. "We bring before you this woman, accused of practicing dark magic and bringing misfortune to our people. We ask you to judge her guilt or innocence, to reveal the truth that human eyes cannot see." The ritual that followed was unlike anything the younger villagers had ever witnessed. Old Maeva spoke in a language that predated their common tongue, her words flowing like ancient music through the grove. She burned herbs that filled the air with thick, sweet smoke and scattered the bones of small animals in patterns around the altar. The very air seemed to respond to her chanting, growing thick and heavy like water. According to the old laws, the spirits would send signs to reveal Amara's guilt or innocence. If she was pure, they would send protective animals or gentle weather. If she was corrupted by dark magic, they would send omens of evil attacking ravens, sudden storms, or unnatural darkness. For the first hour, nothing happened. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the mist and warming the stones of the grove. Amara lay on the altar, trying to stay calm, while hundreds of eyes watched her every movement. Some villagers began to whisper that perhaps the spirits were refusing to judge, that the case was too unclear for divine intervention. Then the wind began to change. At first, it was just a slight shift in direction, barely noticeable among the mountain breezes. But gradually, it grew stronger, colder, carrying with it the scent of distant storms. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon with unnatural speed, rolling across the sky like spilled ink. The temperature dropped so suddenly that people's breath began to mist in the air. Old Maeva smiled with grim satisfaction. "See how the spirits answer," she called out. "They send storms to show their displeasure." This woman is guilty of the charges against her. But then something unexpected happened. From somewhere far down the mountain trail came the sound of galloping hooves. The noise grew louder and closer, accompanied by the jingle of weapons and the snort of a horse pushed to its limits. Every head turned toward the sound, and conversations died as people strained to see what was approaching. A lone rider burst into the grove on a massive warhorse, both mount and rider breathing hard from their desperate climb up the mountain trail. The horse was black as midnight, with wild eyes and foam at its mouth. Its rider was unlike anyone the villagers had ever seen. A young man in his mid-20s, tall and powerfully built, wearing armor that had seen many battles. Scars crisscrossed his arms and face, and his dark hair was tied back with leather cord. A great sword hung at his side, and a bow was strapped to his back alongside a quiver full of arrows. The stranger's eyes swept across the scene in the grove, taking in the chained woman, the ritual preparations and the crowd of spectators. His expression was one of barely controlled anger, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to command. "What madness is this?" he demanded, dismounting with fluid grace despite his heavy armor. "What crime has this woman committed that requires such treatment?" Old Maeva stepped forward, her ceremonial robes rustling around her thin frame. She was not intimidated by this interruption. She had conducted sacred rituals for over 40 years, and no mere warrior would stop her from completing her duty to the spirits. "Stranger, you have no right to interfere with our sacred laws," she said coldly. "This woman stands accused of witchcraft and dark magic." The spirits themselves are judging her guilt. The warrior's eyes moved to Amara, and for a moment something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition of some kind. She was still beautiful, even in chains, even with fear and exhaustion marking her features. But more than that, there was something in her eyes that spoke of innocence and courage, qualities he had learned to recognize during his years of fighting real evil. "And what evidence do you have of this witchcraft?" he asked, his hand resting casually on his sword hilt. The gesture appeared relaxed, but every villager present understood the implied threat. "Look at her!" old Maeva shrieked, pointing her gnarled finger at Amara. "No natural woman possesses such beauty." "She bewitches men's minds and brings chaos wherever she goes. Last night at our festival, grown men fought like wild beasts just to stand near her." The warrior studied Amara more carefully, noting the intelligence in her eyes, the way she held herself with dignity despite her circumstances. He had seen real witches before, had fought creatures of genuine dark magic. This girl radiated nothing but fear and confused innocence. "I am Kale of the Northern Reaches," he announced, his voice carrying across the grove. "I have spent 10 years hunting real evil demons, dark sorcerers, creatures that feed on human suffering. I have seen true corruption, and I tell you now that this woman is innocent of the charges against her." A murmur ran through the crowd. The Northern Reaches were legendary, a wild land where only the strongest and bravest could survive. Stories spoke of the warriors who emerged from that harsh country, men and women who could face down monsters that would send armies fleeing in terror. Old Maeva's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "And how would you know, stranger? Are you perhaps in league with this witch? Has she cast her spells upon you as well?" Kale's laugh was harsh and without humor. "Old woman, I have faced creatures whose beauty was a weapon sharper than any blade, who could bewitch a man's mind with a glance and steal his soul with a kiss. If this girl possessed such powers, I would sense them immediately. She is guilty of nothing more than being born beautiful in a village full of superstitious fools." The insult hung in the air like a challenge. Several village men stepped forward angrily, their hands moving to their own weapons. They might be farmers and craftsmen rather than trained warriors, but they outnumbered this arrogant stranger 50-1. The tension in the grove grew thick enough to cut. But Kale wasn't finished speaking. He had traveled a long way to reach this village, drawn by stories he had heard in taverns and trading posts along the road. Tales of a girl so beautiful that she was being accused of witchcraft, of a trial that would take place in an ancient grove. Something about those stories had resonated with him, reminding him of events from his own past that he preferred to keep buried. "Furthermore," he continued, his voice growing stronger and more commanding, "your so-called trial is meaningless. These omens you speak of prove nothing except that a storm is approaching. I've seen men condemned to death because a crow flew overhead at the wrong moment, and innocent women burned alive because the wind changed direction." He gestured toward the darkening sky, where lightning was beginning to flicker among the heavy clouds. "That storm has been building since yesterday evening. I've been watching it track across the mountains for hours. It has nothing to do with spirits or guilt. It's simply weather, following the natural patterns of wind and pressure that any experienced traveler learns to read." Old Maeva's face flushed with rage. "You dare mock our sacred traditions? These rituals have protected our village for hundreds of years. The spirits speak through signs that only the wise can interpret." "Then let me offer you a different interpretation," Kale said, stepping closer to the altar where Amara lay chained. "If your spirits truly wish to condemn this woman, why did they send a warrior to speak in her defense? Why did they guide my horse up that treacherous mountain trail in record time, arriving at the precise moment when judgment was to be passed?" The question caught everyone off guard. Even old Maeva hesitated, her certainty wavering for the first time since the trial began. The timing of the warrior's arrival was indeed remarkable, almost as if some greater force had arranged for him to be here at this crucial moment. Kale pressed his advantage. "I propose a different trial. Release this woman and grant me the right to champion her innocence through combat. If your accusations are true, surely your strongest warriors, blessed by righteous spirits, can defeat one man. But if she is innocent as I believe, then divine justice will guide my sword to victory. The challenge sent a shockwave through the crowd. Trial by combat was an ancient rite, older even than the ritual they were currently witnessing. By the old laws, if a champion stepped forward to defend an accused person, the matter could be settled through martial trial rather than mystical signs. Old Maeva found herself trapped by her own traditions. She could not refuse the challenge without admitting that her accusations might be false, but she could see the warrior's skill in the way he moved, the confidence in his stance, the quality of his weapons and armor. Few men in their peaceful village could hope to match such a fighter. The storm was growing stronger now, and the first fat raindrops began to fall. Lightning illuminated the grove in stark white flashes, and thunder echoed off the mountainsides like the drums of war. The ancient trees creaked and swayed in the rising wind, their twisted branches reaching toward the boiling sky. "Very well," old Maeva said finally, her voice barely audible above the growing storm. "But you will face our 3 strongest fighters together. If you can defeat them all, the woman goes free. If you fall, she burns at sunrise tomorrow." Kale nodded grimly. Agreed. "But first, release her from those chains. Let her stand and witness her own trial, as is her right under the old laws." Reluctantly, the village guards unlocked Amara's shackles. She sat up slowly, rubbing her wrists where the metal had cut into her skin. Her eyes met Kale's, and she saw something there that gave her the first spark of hope she had felt since her nightmare began. "Why?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from hours of fear and silence. "Why would you risk your life for a stranger?" Kale's expression softened slightly as he looked down at her. "Because I once knew someone like you. Someone who was punished for being different, condemned for gifts she never asked for. I failed to save her." His voice dropped to a whisper that only she could hear. "I won't fail again." The storm finally broke over the sacred grove with full fury, as if the very heavens were weeping for all the innocent people who had suffered and died in that ancient circle of trees. Rain lashed down in torrents, turning the ground to mud and making the stones slippery as ice. Lightning split the sky with increasing frequency, and the thunder came so close behind each flash that the very earth seemed to shake. But neither the storm nor the growing darkness could stop what was about to unfold. 3 village men stepped forward to face the stranger who had dared to challenge their justice. They were the blacksmith, the captain of the village guard, and a retired soldier who had once served in the king's army. All were skilled fighters in their own right. All were convinced of their righteous cause. Kale drew his great sword, the steel singing as it cleared the scabbard. In the flickering lightning, the blade seemed to gleam with its own inner fire. He had fought in 100 battles, faced demons and monsters that most people believed existed only in nightmares, but never had a fight mattered to him more than this one. Amara watched from beside the altar, her heart pounding as she realized that her entire future hung on the outcome of this battle. Rain plastered her dark hair to her skull and soaked through her thin dress, but she barely noticed the cold. All her attention was focused on the warrior who had appeared like an answer to her desperate prayers. The 3 village fighters spread out, trying to surround Kale and attack from multiple angles, but the warrior was ready for them. As the first lightning flash illuminated the grove, the battle began in earnest, steel ringing against steel, while the storm raged overhead and the ancient trees bore witness to yet another trial in their long, dark history. The clash of steel echoed through the sacred grove like thunder, blending with the storm's fury as 4 warriors fought beneath the ancient trees. Kale moved with deadly precision, his great sword weaving patterns of defense and attack that kept his 3 opponents at bay despite their numerical advantage. The blacksmith swung his heavy hammer with crushing force, while the guard captain thrust with his spear and the old soldier attempted to flank with his curved saber. Lightning illuminated the battle in brief, stark moments, Kale spinning away from the hammer's devastating swing, his blade deflecting the spear thrust while simultaneously parrying the saber cut. Mud splashed beneath their feet as they circled and struck, the rain making every step treacherous and every grip uncertain. The villagers pressed closer despite the danger, their faces reflecting the lightning flashes as they watched the supernatural combat. Old Maeva stood like a statue among them, her ceremonial robes whipping in the wind, her eyes fixed on the battle with terrible intensity. She had staked her reputation and authority on this trial, and she knew that if the warrior won, her power in the village would be broken forever. Amara clutched the stone altar for support, her knuckles white with tension. Every time one of the village fighters came close to landing a blow, Her heart stopped. She could barely comprehend that this stranger was risking his life for her, that someone finally believed in her innocence when everyone else saw only evil. The blacksmith struck first, his hammer whistling through the air with enough force to shatter bones. But Kael was no longer where the blow was aimed. He had dropped into a crouch, letting the weapon pass overhead, then surged upward with his sword in a powerful thrust. The blade pierced through the blacksmith's leather apron and into his chest, finding the gap in his makeshift armor with surgical precision. The big man's eyes went wide with shock and pain. He staggered backward, dropping his hammer, and collapsed to his knees in the mud. Dark blood mixed with the rainwater as his life flowed away into the sacred earth. His wife's scream cut through the storm, but there was no time for mourning. The battle continued with even greater ferocity. The guard captain and the old soldier redoubled their efforts, attacking Kael from opposite sides in perfect coordination. They were good fighters, experienced and disciplined, but they were not prepared for the sheer skill and ruthlessness of a warrior forged in the brutal conflicts of the northern reaches. Kael had learned to fight not for sport or honor, but for survival against enemies that showed no mercy and gave no quarter. He caught the spear thrust on his sword's crossguard and twisted, snapping the wooden shaft in half. Before the captain could draw his backup weapon, Kael's blade swept across in a horizontal arc that opened the man's throat in a spray of crimson. The captain fell beside the blacksmith, his life ending in seconds. Now only the old soldier remained, and he found himself facing a warrior whose prowess far exceeded anything he had ever encountered. During his years in the king's army, he had considered himself one of the finest swordsmen in the realm. But against Kael, he felt like a clumsy child wielding a stick against a master craftsman. Their blades met and parted in a deadly dance, steel ringing against steel while lightning split the sky above them. The old soldier fought with desperate courage, knowing that retreat meant death and that his only chance lay in finding some flaw in his opponent's technique. But Kael's defense was perfect, his attacks relentless and precise. The end came when the soldier overextended himself in a desperate lunge, hoping to pierce Kael's heart with one final committed thrust. But the warrior sidestepped with fluid grace, and his counterattack was swift and merciless. His great sword took the soldier's head from his shoulders in a single clean stroke, the body continuing its forward momentum for several steps before collapsing in the mud. Silence fell over the sacred grove, broken only by the sound of rain and the distant rumble of thunder as the storm began to move away toward the eastern mountains. Kael stood among the three corpses, his sword dripping with blood and rainwater, his chest rising and falling with deep, controlled breaths. He had fought many battles, but few had meant as much to him as this one. Old Maeva stared at the scene in horror and disbelief. Her champions were dead, cut down like wheat before the scythe. According to the ancient laws, this meant that the spirits had spoken clearly in favor of the accused woman's innocence. But accepting that verdict meant admitting that she had been wrong, that she had nearly murdered an innocent person based on superstition and fear. "Impossible," she whispered, then raised her voice to a shriek that cut through the storm. "Sorcery!" "He fights with dark magic. No mortal man could defeat 3 warriors so easily." Several villagers nodded in agreement, their fear and shock making them grasp for any explanation that would preserve their worldview. But others looked at the scene more thoughtfully, remembering stories they had heard about the warriors of the northern reaches, about men and women who could fight like legends come to life. Kael wiped the blood from his blade and sheathed it with a decisive motion. When he spoke, his voice carried across the grove with absolute authority. "The trial is finished. The combat has been decided. By your own laws and traditions, this woman is proven innocent. Any who would challenge this verdict must face me directly." He looked around the crowd, meeting the eyes of each person in turn. Most looked away, unable to hold his gaze. A few of the younger men showed signs of anger and defiance, but none stepped forward to take up the challenge. They had just watched him kill 3 skilled fighters with apparent ease. Only a fool would face him now. Amara rose from beside the altar, her legs shaking with relief and exhaustion. She walked slowly toward Kael, stepping carefully around the pools of blood that mixed with the rainwater. When she reached him, she looked up into his scarred face with tears streaming down her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rain. "I don't understand why you did this, but thank you." Kael's expression softened as he looked down at her. For a moment, the hardness left his eyes, replaced by something that might have been tenderness. "You don't need to thank me," Justice is its own reward. But old Maeva was not finished. She stepped forward with her ceremonial staff raised like a weapon, her face twisted with fanatical rage. I will not accept this mockery of our sacred traditions. If the spirits will not deliver justice, then I will take it with my own hands. She lunged at Amara with surprising speed for such an elderly woman, the pointed end of her staff aimed at the girl's heart. But Cale had anticipated the attack. His hand moved to his belt and came up with a throwing knife that gleamed silver in the lightning. The blade took old Maeva in the throat, spinning her around before she collapsed beside the altar she had served for so many years. The crowd gasped in shock and terror as their high priestess died in the mud with the sacrificial blood of centuries. Some fell to their knees, convinced that the gods would now destroy their village for this desecration. Others began to back away, afraid that more violence would follow. But Cale had no interest in further bloodshed. He turned to address the terrified villagers, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable threat. This ends now. The trial is over. Justice has been served, and this woman is under my protection. Anyone who threatens her or her family will answer to me personally. Is that understood? Murmurs of fearful agreement rippled through the crowd. Without their leaders and champions, the villagers had no stomach for further confrontation with this deadly stranger. They began to disperse, hurrying back down the mountain trail through the diminishing rain, eager to escape the grove that had seen so much bloodshed. Within an hour, only Amara, Cale, and the dead remained in the sacred grove. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky full of stars and a world washed clean by the rain. The ancient trees stood silent and impassive, having witnessed yet another chapter in the long story of human folly and courage. Amara sat on a fallen log trying to process everything that had happened. Her life had been shattered and rebuilt in the span of a single day, and she wasn't sure how to move forward. The villagers might be too frightened to attack her directly now, but she knew that she could never truly be safe in Cathara. There would always be whispers, always be fear, always be those who believed that her beauty was somehow unnatural. What happens now? She asked quietly. Cale was cleaning his weapons, a routine that seemed automatic after years of fighting. Now you have a choice, he said without looking up. You can stay here and try to rebuild your life among people who will always fear you. Or you can come with me. Come with you where? He gestured toward the north, where distant mountains rose like purple shadows against the star-filled sky. I was traveling to the capital when I heard about your situation. There are places there where being beautiful isn't considered a curse, where people judge others by their actions rather than their appearance. You could start fresh, become whoever you want to be. The offer hung in the air between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Amara thought of her mother, probably weeping at home and fearing the worst. She thought of the small herb garden they tended together, the familiar streets of her childhood, the life she had known before everything changed. But she also thought of the fear in people's eyes, the stones they had thrown, the chains that had bound her to the sacrificial altar. She thought of how close she had come to dying for the crime of being born beautiful in a world full of superstition. My mother, she said finally. I can't leave without saying goodbye. Cale nodded understandingly. We'll stop at your house on the way down the mountain. But we shouldn't linger. Fear makes people do stupid things, and I'd rather not have to kill any more of your neighbors tonight. They made their way down the treacherous trail by starlight, leading Cale's horse carefully over the rain-slicked rocks. The village below was dark and silent, with most people hiding in their homes and praying that the strange warrior would simply leave without causing more trouble. Amara's mother was waiting when they reached the small house by the village outskirts. Ilara threw her arms around her daughter, sobbing with relief and joy. She had been certain that Amara was dead, that the trial would end with fire and screaming, and the loss of everything she held dear. I heard the fighting, she whispered through her tears. I heard the thunder and the shouting, and I thought you were gone forever. Amara held her mother tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of herbs and wool that had meant safety throughout her childhood. I'm alive, Mother. This warrior Cale, he saved me. He proved my innocence in trial by combat. Alara looked at the scarred stranger who stood respectfully outside their door, rain still dripping from his dark hair. She could see the quality of his weapons and armor, the way he moved with deadly grace even in stillness. More importantly, she could see the kindness in his eyes when he looked at her daughter. Thank you, she said simply. How can I ever repay you for giving me back my child? Keep her safe, Cale replied. That's payment enough. But as they talked, it became clear that staying in Cathara was not a real option. Too many people had seen what happened in the sacred grove, had watched their leaders die defending what they believed was right. Fear and resentment would simmer beneath the surface like poison, waiting for the moment when the dangerous warrior was no longer there to protect the witch who had caused so much trouble. Elara understood this as well as anyone. She had lived in the village her entire life, had seen how long people could hold grudges and nursed their hatred. With old Marva dead and the traditional power structure shattered, there would be chaos and blame, and her daughter would be an easy target for people looking for someone to punish. "Go," she said finally, though the words clearly broke her heart. "Go with him to the capital. Make a new life where you can be happy. I'll follow when I can arrange to sell the house and settle our affairs." They spent one last hour together, mother and daughter sharing memories and promises while Kale waited outside with his horse. As dawn approached, it was time to leave. The eastern sky was already showing the first pale hints of sunrise, and Kale wanted to be well away from the village before people began stirring and perhaps working up the courage for revenge. Amara kissed her mother goodbye, both women weeping openly now. She took only a small bundle of clothes and her grandmother's jewelry, leaving behind everything else that had defined her life up to this moment. As she climbed onto Kale's horse behind him, she felt as though she was being reborn, stepping from one existence into another entirely. They rode north as the sun rose behind them, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reflected off the wet stones of the mountain peaks. Amara looked back once at the village that had been her whole world, at the smoke beginning to rise from breakfast fires and the people starting to move through the familiar streets, but she did not look back again. The future lay ahead, uncertain, but full of possibilities she had never dared to imagine. Beside her rode a warrior who had risked everything to save a stranger, who had seen past her beauty to the person underneath, and chosen to stand with her against an entire village worth of fear and hatred. As they crested the first hill and Cathara disappeared behind them forever, Amara felt something she had almost forgotten existed: hope. Perhaps there truly were places in the world where being different was not a crime, where beauty could be a gift instead of a curse, where people could build new lives free from the superstitions and fears of the past. The road to the capital was long and filled with unknown dangers, but for the first time in her life, Amara was not traveling it alone. Whatever awaited them in the world beyond the mountains, they would face it together. Warrior and accused witch, protector and protected, two souls who had found each other in the darkness and chosen to walk toward the light. Behind them, the sacred grove stood empty except for the dead, while the ancient trees whispered secrets to the wind and waited for the next chapter in the endless story of human struggle against the forces of ignorance and fear. But for Amara and KL, that story was just beginning.